The time to build is upon us.
With great power comes great responsibility.
You know the greatest danger facing us is ourselves, an irrational fear of the unknown.
Not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
This is the SuperHuman Academy Podcast.
Well, I'm super excited to be joined today by Dr. Boris Konrad. I'm not going to give a lengthy introduction because I want him to share a lot about himself rather than me doing it. But super special honor and really exciting. Dr. Boris Konrad has a lot of experience with memory championships. He's a neuroscientist, and he's been doing research for a long time, and he's going to share some of the new stuff that he's been learning recently with us. So, Dr. Boris, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. So the first thing I wanted to ask about, because people in the superlearner world tend to know a little bit about memory championships, tend to know a little bit about how learning in the brain works, but we often get things a couple years delay from when they're discovered, when things come out, and you're kind of on the cutting edge. So I'd love to hear what have you been researching recently? What have you been learning?
Sure. So maybe I start a little step earlier, what we've done before and what's most recent. But I did my PhD in Munich already, finished it in 2014 on the neurocorrelates of superior memory performances, which is basically an fMRI study on memory athletes. So people who competed in memory competitions, and back then we invited the back then top 50 in the world to take part in our studies, put them in the MRI, put them in the sleep lab, give them a bunch of memory tasks and other cognitive tasks. And then in follow-up steps, we did training studies where we invited just average students. Still, average students at the high-class university are not average people. I'm aware of that, but yeah, a common issue in many studies, of course. But we had students, and they got to undergo a training with me, basically a training in mnemonic techniques for a couple of hours, then practice at home for 6 weeks, 20 to 30 minutes per day. And then we compared that with working memory training, like it had been popular for many years in some scientific communities, where you basically do working memory tasks all over again, like NBAC tasks, where you have to, is this the same butterfly you've seen 3 clicks before? These kind of things, and compare that with another passive control group. And we didn't find actually that much difference in what in the brain lights up in lay terms during the tasks, but quite a bit in networks. That already 6 weeks of training were enough to induce visible changes in brain networks, which basically means that, for example, the prefrontal cortex, the medial temporal lobe, where the hippocampus is in, and the visual cortex showed stronger connections, not during task, but at rest after just a couple of weeks of training. And that very much was in line with what we found in the memory athletes. In recent years, already 9 years ago, I joined the Dondes Institute for Brain Cognition and Behavior in Nijmegen in the Netherlands. It's a pretty large institute for neuroscience. We have by now, not back then, but by now, more than 800 people, more than 40 research groups in 4 centers, all doing cognitive neuroscience, which is amazing. Still the whole pathway from the wet lab to the clinic, but also strong focus on neuroimaging, for example. And our last paper, which by now is, again, 1.5 years old already, was quite interesting to me, where we looked a little more specific into basically effort, durability of memories formed with mnemonic techniques. And here we could show that both in a group of memory athletes, but also in neuro training studies, we could see that people who are sufficiently trained in using mnemonic techniques, which can be achieved in just 6 weeks, show less effort, brain effort, or basically brain activity in specific tasks while memorizing than a control group. So despite memorizing way more, already our training group, after just 6 weeks, a task like memorizing a word list or memorizing names and faces can triple their performance, right? But still, it costs them less energy. So it really shows it's more or less directing the way the brain likes to work best. So it's oversimplified, but typically says that the brain wants to use the least amount of energy always. And we really see this here. So it aligns with the neuroefficiency theory that we actually, despite having higher performance, see less effort, which also explains why, for example, for a memory athlete, even memorizing half a book is not really draining too much energy or too tiring, because if you have the methodology to do so, it's just how your brain works. It doesn't mean that effort and activation wouldn't go up if you look into the most difficult tasks. So it's hard to do in a scanner, but it would be pretty clear if you have brain scan of memory athletes trying to memorize 1,000 numbers in 15 minutes, a world-class performance. This would be very high in both effort and mental activation. But for the everyday tasks, despite higher performance, we don't see them. And we could also show that these trainings and mnemonic techniques directly lead to building long-term memory. I've done it previously a little bit already in my PhD study, where I could show that memory athletes, so back then we did the elite group, who memorized the string of digits, 120 digits. For non-trained people, it sounds amazing and impossible. For memory athletes, yeah, okay, quickly, let me do that. And this, when they just memorize, then directly afterwards retrieve it. Even most memory researchers I ask at conferences to test them, what they would say, we're really sure we will mostly see working memory activation, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, typical areas found in studies where you look into activation of working memory retrieval. But it's absolutely not what we find. It's exactly the brain activation we see when they remember digits learned several days ago. So it clearly shows these mnemonic techniques. Again, they have to be prepared. It's not like you follow the training, this happens right away. But if they are overlearned, they know their memory palaces extremely well. They've used them dozens or hundreds of times. So these are clearly long-term memory. And if these are used to memorize something new, it directly is retrieved from long-term memory without needing days, weeks, or even months of memory consolidation. And I think, and I also see this in citations the paper is already getting. This has been quite fascinating for even scientific community. So that's pretty nice. So just a few weeks back, we had in Huntington Beach this year's International Conference on Learning and Memory, the largest neuroscientific conference on memory research, more than, I think, 1,200 people this time from all over the world flew to California to discuss the latest in memory research. And it's clearly something people are interested in. And if I look at, for example, this conference, I think there were some themes there which now sparked my interest for our follow-up work, which we might also address. For example, the role of boundaries in memory seems to regain attention. And I think this is something, mnemonic techniques, I never thought about it earlier, but that's something on my mind a lot right now, is also adding kind of automatically without putting the purpose, because in the memory palace, each room or maybe even each location defines or gives a boundary, which is often lacking in particular in verbal learning tasks. So this might be an additional hint, which we didn't investigate so far, why mnemonic techniques work quite well. So these are things. So right now, just to end my monologue here and give a clear picture, I still work 2 days per week in research. So my contract with the Institute is 2 days per week. I get to supervise a PhD student who's amazing, who's at the moment doing lots of advanced analysis of the data we collected over the last few years with some RSA, some more advanced methodologies to investigate those data, but mostly confirming what we've shown before, but still very important and relevant data. And I'm also having some more applied studies at the moment. We developed an app where we teach quite young kids, actually, in the Netherlands, the memory palace as a tool to use while learning to read. So we don't really teach them the memory palace method, but it's an app, and there are little figures, characters who live in their own house. Surprise. And then in the house, they collect words that follow the same Dutch grammar rule. They all end up in the same room, and kids just have to visualize those words in the same room. And we hope, first pilots were really promising. This helps them to later then, without being told explicitly, remember, the tree was in the same room as the fish, to use some Dutch words. So both have this rule where they have the double consonant, which in the plural changes. And this seems to work. So at the moment we are investigating that. And also, since the first studies were promising, are now quite hopeful to get a little more research funding, which will allow me to employ a postdoc and a PhD student for 4 years to really investigate the use of mnemonic techniques in learning to read and also in advance reading skills in younger kids. And at the other end of the life period, I'm working with a Dutch startup called Tuluba Memory Enhancing Technology, who acquired some nice grants to develop, again, an app for using mnemonic techniques in dementia prevention. Because, of course, individualized cognitive training is a big thing in that field, but it's also difficult. And this field, even more than others, often confuses memory strategies with just training your memory by doing memory exercises. Therefore, sometimes meta-analysis. I wasn't so happy with really pulled stuff together that's not the same. And too often people are addressed who are sadly a step or two too far along the way of a dementia's trajectory. So basically, if you come to a memory clinic and are diagnosed with, certainly if it's already early Alzheimer's, but even if it's mild cognitive impairment, which very often will lead to Alzheimer later on, it's probably too late to do a memory training where you really first have to learn a strategy. But we are pretty hopeful, convinced is a too strong word yet, but hopeful that if you start earlier, we know that the pathology, what's happening in the brain, probably starts 20 years before symptoms show up, that you then still can grow your cognitive reserve quite a lot. Which, again, probably does not mean that you stop or actually influence the disease by itself, the pathology, too much. Probably the bad things happening in your brain are not influenced by how you use it, but you can massively build up your cognitive reserve and gain years of life quality. Yeah, that's the goal of the startup, and I'm the one who's allowed to work with them on the scientific side. And I could now get a little grant from the Alzheimer Foundation of the Netherlands and work with our geriatrics department at the local university medical center to really investigate that scientifically as well. So for me, it's still like the core is still neuroimaging of mnemonic techniques in healthy young adults, but also the more applicable sides in different angles. Yeah, I do this half my time basically, and the other half of my time I'm also out in the world, mostly giving lectures, sometimes being in the media to share this, because I still feel the scientific world is not open enough, and it's even getting worse because with the general, a little more anti-scientific atmosphere you have in some circles, to speak carefully, it leads to some scientists being even more careful to speak out and share their knowledge. And I think it's exactly the wrong thing to do. So if you get public funding, if you have amazing results, those should go out there. So I'm quite happy to think I have somewhat of a skill to translate scientific stuff also into a little more lay terms, and with speeches, media appearances, and my books, hope to reach people with that.
Yeah, well, we all really appreciate it. It's great to have, right from the horse's mouth, someone who's, on the cutting edge, sharing these things. So I just want to see if I listened well. I'm going to summarize some of the things I heard, key points, make sure I understood them right. Some of this stuff these are things that I explain and teach people, but I do it very much from just a practical coaching standpoint, right? I'm not someone who's done the research or anything like that. I just share things that I've learned along the way. So it's always great for me to have the opportunity to kind of test. All right, here's the way I explain this. Is that, scientifically correct? So to go back to some of the early things you said. So you said you have memory experts, people who have competed. You do some brain scans while they're actively trying to memorize information. You do the same for people who have not really trained, and the difference doesn't seem to be in, and I think this has been shown a few times, the difference doesn't seem to be in the brain structures or anything like that. It's not like people who compete in memory competitions have like completely different looking brain than somebody else. It's just that different pathways or different networks seem to be activating. Did I get that part right?
Yep.
Okay, so that's the first piece. And then you said after just 6 weeks of training, somebody who has no prior memory competition experience, anything like that, can start to activate those same networks as the very well-trained people. Did I get that right too?
Yeah, so probably could activate the networks before, but it does so more systematically and even at rest. So even when we scan outside of a task, just ask people to lay in the scanner at rest, and
Okay.
Resting state analysis. Yeah.
So so if I understood that right, so once they've gone through training, it's not just that they are using more efficient networks when they're actively trying to memorize something. They're just using more efficient networks to remember things in general throughout their daily life, even if they're not actively applying specific techniques consciously. Did I get that right?
Yeah, a way I sometimes like to phrase this is also that we see that, of course, we all have quite a number of different memory systems. So it's easy to joke about, and most people who complain my memory is bad. But if you ask them about song text from the 80s, they know all of it. So bad it doesn't seem to be, but it's the specific memory system they're more happy with than the other one. And often they are, in some tests, even competing. So if you have some more kind of pair-based learning, like in vocabulary learning or typical lab tasks, you have somewhat memory systems that might even compete. So the one has to go down so the other can go up. In the aftermath of a good memory training with memory strategies, it starts to cooperate more. And we see this by brain network changes even at rest after a couple of weeks training.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And then the next thing, so the memory techniques you're talking about, I mean, you mentioned memory palaces. I'm guessing mostly what we're talking about is memory palaces, visualization of information, linking those things together, chunking, all of that.
Yeah, basically.
Okay. the normal memory technique stuff. Okay, great. I'm always curious if there's anything that I haven't heard of yet, because I've been around the block a few times with the memory stuff. But every once in a while, someone surprises me. It's something I haven't thought of before. All right, so that's a really interesting insight. So for people listening, just 6 weeks. Already some market improvement in the way that people are processing, being more efficient with remembering things, not just when they're actively consciously using techniques, but in general throughout their life. So if you are someone who feels like you struggle with memory, you say that you have a bad memory, though it's questionable what exactly that means. It doesn't take that long to really make significant and lasting changes. Another thing you said towards the end there, relating to dementia and Alzheimer's, you're basically, if I'm understanding correctly, saying that if you start to practice memory techniques, if you start to train your memory early on, you can really prevent or at least delay or minimize those sorts of diseases and effects later in life. It seems that way, at least based on your research.
Yeah, I think you said it nicely at the end. It seems that way. We need more research. That's what I told the funding agencies, that they need to give me more money. You can do the research. We have studies, of course, we can cite some American studies, some of our own work, but there have been other studies, as I mentioned, that were less promising. I usually have quite quickly, when I read those papers, some concerns why I believe that might be the case, but therefore should be a little careful how we word it. But I'm pretty convinced it's helpful in this domain as well, and hope we can investigate it further.
Okay. So yeah, so one of the like kind of main questions I wanted to talk through today was, what's the practical value of memory training? Because a lot of times when I'm telling people about if they haven't heard of memory athletes or memory competition before, they hear things like people are memorizing decks of playing cards, they're memorizing names and faces, they're memorizing random numbers, and it's like, okay, that's really cool. I'm impressed that they can do things like that, but who cares? And I think you've already answered that question to some degree. Is like, okay, well, the memory techniques themselves aren't everything. It's not just about being able to memorize decks of playing cards. It's like cool if you can do that, but it improves your learning and memory ability overall. In general, you're using more efficient networks in order to learn, and also it's good for your brain health. I think it's, when I hear that question, I know because I've done this training quite a bit, but to me, it's almost like asking, like, why bother going to the gym? Why bother working out? It's like, when are you ever going to do a certain move? When are you ever going to do a bench press in real life? Like, how often are you laying on the ground and needing to push something off of yourself? What's the point of doing that? I mean, some people do, but I think to me, it's kind of a similar question. It's like, well, it improves your overall health and quality of life in every other area if you do this sort of training. And sometimes it does apply in very specific ways. Do you feel like, is that kind of how you would answer the question, or what's your take on that?
Yeah, I like to use a similar answer. So the 2 points you mentioned are important. I think the third one is that these techniques are more applicable than most people see at first. And yes, it's absolutely true. When I learn a new language, I will not be 50 times better than the average learner. I'll probably be able to memorize a deck of playing cards 50 times faster. If someone even manages at all, it might take them the whole day and I take 30 seconds. It's way more than 50 times better. Of course, I will not be 50 times faster learning Spanish, Italian, or whatever language I want to learn. I might not even be 10 times faster. But if I'm 2 to 3 times faster, that's still absolutely amazing, right? And that's definitely the case. So you can apply it to different amounts. What we do in those studies I briefly mentioned with also the kids, it's still like we apply it to stuff. So it's not just they do the training and then they read better. It's still applied in the process. by, in this case, having young kids picture words in rooms, because that's basically the idea of the memory palace technique, very simplified. They don't get a training, they just get to see it in the app. They find it funny that they, instead of being asked to read this word, and they might already have had failure in the past, and teachers saying them, no, you're wrong. But no, they have success. And well, don't even bother. But hey, picture there's a fish swimming over the television, and there's a tree growing out of your table. Oh, that's fun. And then suddenly you still build something that's useful afterwards. So when I memorize vocabulary in a different language, it doesn't mean I speak language fluently a weekend later, but it still means I have a huge advantage when then building the skill. When I go to a scientific conference as a researcher, I will not have understood every paper presented there just by having heard it once. I'm probably the only one who sits in the plane bag, in this case from Huntington Beach, and knows every single poster I looked at and every single speech I listened to. Not in all details, but I could tell you every single one I dealt with. And yes, I will forget some because I realized, I didn't like it. It wasn't relevant. I'm waiting for the update. But those that are relevant, I will still have in my head. And then I'll still look it up on Google Scholar or ask them to send me the draft. But already I have more connections because I put it in memory palaces, more things to fall back to. And when I read it again, or just actually had it 2 weeks back, one of the students in our lab, in our journal club, presented a paper where I then thought, wait, this sounds familiar. Oh yeah, I saw the researcher give a talk in Huntington Beach in May, and it still came back despite it wasn't on the things I rehearsed a lot because it was just somewhat relevant. So it's still there when I encounter it again to fall back to. So it certainly has its uses there.
Yeah, I've definitely found in my experience, I've definitely noticed that, as long as I'm actually interested and I'm actually paying attention to things, even if I don't use any sort of fancy technique, I notice that I recall things a lot better than I used to before I started any sort of memory training. And I'm not really trying to per se, but if I'm interested, if I'm paying attention, if I'm engaged, it seems like my recall is far better than most people I interact with, at least like months later. Like I'll remember something from a book that I read in a conversation, and it's not an effort to pull it up. And sometimes, everybody forgets things, and forgetting is an important function. It's a good thing. I think sometimes people, when we talk about these things, are like, well, do you forget anything? It's like, of course. That wouldn't make any sense for my brain to remember everything. There's no point in doing that. But the things that are important that I want to remember, even without thinking too much about it, they tend to stick around a lot better and be more accessible. So I can just speak from my experience on that. One thing I wanted to ask. Go ahead.
If we can add one point with memory sports. So I like the analogy with other sports. So what's the point of running 42 kilometers in 2 hours when you just back at where you started? That's not the point, but it's also not possible for most people. Most of us wouldn't be able to run a marathon at all. Nearly everyone, at least who is somewhat healthy, will be able to train themselves to the point that you can finish a marathon in 5 hours, in 4 hours. And then if you're ambitious, it's probably possible to get to 3.5 hours. And probably for most healthy people, even 3 hours is somewhat realistic. But it's still an hour away from the 2 hours where the world record is standing. So if the world record in memorizing a deck of cards by now is far under 20 seconds, that might not be possible for anyone. And it's certainly not the goal for most people. It's just a sport. It doesn't have a direct application. But for example, to learn once to memorize a deck of playing cards and then train it to a level that you can do it in 5 minutes, it doesn't take years of your life or even months. It's quickly soon achieved. And if you did it, it shows to yourself, I can do something I thought was impossible. So that's why I still tell people, I get you don't have to memorize decks of playing cards in your life, and you might even not like playing cards. But hey, if you want to have something measurable where you see your progress, and while doing so, you train the memory palace technique, you train your mental speed and forming these images rather quickly, maybe having the goal to once memorize a deck of cards in 5 minutes isn't that stupid. It could be a good goal. And then if you reach that and you think, well, I'm good with that, it's totally fine. And maybe you got curious and motivated and saying, well, if 5 minutes is possible, why not 4? And then you're hooked and we have someone more for memory sports. That's also fine. But just training something like this, even though it's not directly applicable, it can show to you how these things work. Because I teach also at my university. I have a course, Learn How to Learn for medical students. So if you study medicine in Nijmegen, you have the opportunity. It's elective course, it's usually really well booked to do that. And some of them, I'd speak later, really make good use of that. And others less so. And sometimes they reach out to me, hey, I have my final exam in 2 weeks, and how can I apply this stuff now? Yeah, you can. Success. Some training is necessary. And if you start even with something meaningless, it might not even be the worst idea. Because if you directly want to apply the technique for the most important thing you ever learned in your life, you're meant to fail. This will not work. But if you had this advantage of having practiced with something where you didn't care if you knew it weeks later, then you know the methodology works. Hey, I did this. This was impossible without the technique. And now I built my toolkit. And Memory Palace is one of the tools in there that I can apply for the things I'm really interested in, where I need help or I want to improve.
Yeah, one thing you said in there, I totally resonated with. I've shared this with a bunch of people too, is the idea that, for me at one point, if you'd asked me, I don't know, 8 years ago or something like that, could you memorize 50 digits in a row, 50 random digits? I would have told you, well, maybe I would have to repeat them over to myself. I'd have to keep reading them over, and it would take me, days, maybe even a week to get like the whole 50 sequence. And then I'd probably forget it the next week, whatever. And I would have said to do it in 10 minutes, even an hour, I probably would have said was impossible. And then after doing a little bit of training, I was able to do that within, I don't know, a week, something like that. And I think it was a really powerful revelation that I can think something is impossible and then be able to do it in a short amount of time. Not everything, but if that's ever true, if there's ever a case in which I think something's impossible and I can do it a short time later, it really brings into question, well, what else do I think is impossible right now that I'm very capable of and could figure out within a short amount of time? And it didn't take me a lifetime to be able to memorize 50 digits. It took me like a week, in under 5 minutes. And so that, for me, that was a really huge mental shift where once I realized I could do that, I started to get a lot more excited. And once you get excited about something and passionate, it no longer feels like work. And then it just kind of kept compiling on itself. And so, for anyone who's listening or on the call or watching the recording, I personally, I recommend starting with things like decks of playing cards, numbers, whatever, because it's usually something people feel like they can't do at all. And then it doesn't usually take that long to do. And I think just that little win oftentimes starts to snowball things. So no, memorizing decks of playing cards in itself is usually not useful for most people most of the time. But if you find that you can do that, it can really start, a progression. You start to ask really valuable questions. What else can I do? How else can I apply this? And that's when the fun starts to really happen. I know there's so many things in my life since I started to use memory techniques that I never even would have considered trying to do. But since I had success in those small things, they became, instead of being a closed door, there was like a little crack. I try it. Like, I wonder if I could memorize a book in a couple hours. Never would have tried it before. Now I'm going to give it a shot. And turns out, I could do pretty well. And that's when I think it really starts to change your life. At least that's what it was for me personally. So totally resonate with all of that.
Yeah, I think it's a good way to see it. And then, this word might be fun or not to you. We have by now a format where we do memory sports even faster. It's called Memory League. It's a Californian provider. It's somewhat commercial, but I don't think they really have a big commercial interest behind it. It's more a little fun project for them. But it gained some traction. There is a Twitch channel, which gathers a masses of like 30, 40 people watching memory sports matches. And it's just fun because it's usually 1 minute of memorization time, 4 minutes of recall. So it's 5 minutes to play a game. And by now the community is big enough that most of the time, if you go online, you find someone to play with. And they might be way ahead of you, but it doesn't really matter. And they have competitions, but you can play for yourself. And something I still enjoy. So the times I really competed in world class of memory sports, that's kind of a decade in the past, to be honest, right? So from like 2005 to 2014, so for quite a lot of years, I was really constantly in the top 5 to top 10 of the world. I'm not anymore. It's still fun that without doing much formal training, I pretty much keep my level or even get better. I'm approaching 40 years old, which is not old, but still not 20 anymore. And I'm still better than I ever was. The scores I achieved today would have won me many world championships 20 years ago. Just the level was worse then. And nowadays the level got much better, which can still be motivating for people beginning. But it means that there's also a community around the sport, which can be fun, because the one thing that didn't change at all since day one, still today, 20 years later, that I do it, there was not ever a single time someone showed up who just had a good memory. Every single person there uses mnemonic techniques to do this, and quite similar ones. They all use memory palaces all over the world. We checked it in our studies. How you get images turned into, how you get digits turned into images. That does culturally differ a little bit. Western cultures have these alphabet-based systems, like the major code. Asian countries, like in China, they do it a bit different. But at the end, they also have images instead of digits and put those in the memory palace. Yep. And by now, you have tens of thousands of people around the world who at least once competed in a memory competition, and hundreds who took it a little more serious. So that's also, still very niche, but growing to compare it to what it was. So chances are you will also find people who got into memory sports with a little more purposeful meaning behind it, and then they just liked also the sport. Like you get someone who started to training because the doctor told them you really should move more or strengthen your body, and then they started to enjoy a specific sport. They might even get good at it, but still have the other motivation behind. So it might be worse if you so far ignored it to have a little look into this little weird, little nerdy, but still very fun community of memory athletes out there. And Memory League might be, I'm not affiliated with them, just mentioning it.
Yeah, is that like memoryleague.com? What's the? It
is, yeah.
Okay, memoryleague.com. I actually haven't been to that, but I'll check it out. Yeah, so anyone listening, if you want to play around with some memory techniques, that sounds like a fun place to do it. Check it out.
Exactly. Yeah.
You mentioned, so you said you'll train people for 6 weeks, right? So people who have never, I'm sorry, I'm kind of rewinding way back to something.
Please do.
Yeah. You'll work with people who have never learned any memory techniques before, students. You'll train them for, you said 6 weeks, I think. What does that training consist of? What do you do to help people to adopt these skills?
In these studies, it's still actually pretty basic, because we wanted it to be as comparable as possible. So in this initial training, we built together 2 memory palaces with 25 loci each, one indoor, one outdoor, for neuroimaging reasons that you could compare to completely different settings. But they learned 50 loci basically. And then the first training days is basically applying this to memorize either word lists or sequences of images. And then they will have used those loci, so they might not be able to reuse it right away. So in the first 3 weeks, they build 1 more memory palace per week. They have to type it into a computer system. We haven't been there, but they have to put something in there and later be able to remember it. So if they did it, no one seemed to have cheated, so that was good. And then they use those again to memorize basically word lists and sequences of images. So it's just 2 tasks we gave them. So meaningless information, but very good to train the memory palace technique. And measurable, so that we have same task very often and then see progress. And then one of the tasks we did in the brain scanner was also to memorize 72 words in order. And so basically in the pre-test, there were like 20 to 25 words, usually in this range. And at the end, most were above 60. So we actually had the ceiling effect probably, because we only gave them 72.
Okay, so it sounds like, and I shouldn't assume that everybody listening to this is familiar with memory palace, though it's something that most people in our community are familiar with. So if you're not familiar with that, basically, if you just right now you close your eyes, you just imagine you're in your house or someplace that you've gone a lot of times, right? You can probably kind of walk through it pretty easily in your head. You might not remember where everything is, but you probably have a pretty good idea of the layout of the rooms and furniture and that kind of thing. And so really basic version of the memory palace technique would just be placing, like Dr. Konrad said, like a word in specific locations. Ideally, you turn that into an image. So if the word was cat, well, use a super easy one. You'd imagine a cat, sitting on a chair in a corner or something like that. And then you place the words or the images you have for the words in locations in sequence. So you can remember the sequence by walking through the house in the same same order as usual, just in case people weren't familiar with that. So yeah, so the 6 weeks of training, you're basically just teaching them the most fundamental mechanics of memory palace. Just that basically. Here's I think your house, and you said you haven't picked 25 loci, so you're helping them like select locations along a path as well.
Yeah, so that's still an initial workshop. We do this together twice, 25 locations, and then they have to repeat this in their own home and then choose some other locations where they can all do that.
Yeah. So if you are listening, if you haven't done this before, or if you've dabbled with the memory techniques, but you've never actually just built out a memory palace, that's a great place to start. Like in your house, if you can draw it out, even if it's super basic, like just boxes on a piece of paper is totally fine. You don't have to draw it, but it can be helpful when you're first starting. And then just picking spots and actually labeling them so that way you've got it kind of mapped out in your head. Run through it a few times, think, okay, there's location 1, there's location 2. So you've got it in your head, and then just practice putting things in those locations and seeing if they're still there a couple of days later when you go back to walk through your mental house. That's just a great way to start. And if you see, hey, that actually worked and I remembered things better than I would if I had just repeated them to myself or read them on a piece of paper, then you've just got your start into using memory techniques. So that's a great place to start. And yeah, like within I would say less than 6 weeks, but 6 weeks is a good time frame. Even less than that, I think you'll start to see that it can make a real difference. So start to try it out.
Maybe to answer that, or at the point, sometimes get asked why 6 weeks. It's not that we did pilot studies at 4 weeks and it wasn't enough, and it just it felt like it felt initially like a good period of time, and it worked. So we just kept it. So the studies are comparable. Sure. So probably if you have 4 weeks, you will probably have quite some success. We did not have brain scans every week, and so it needs 6 weeks. So just to make it clear, we initially decided for 6 weeks because we knew it takes some time. 2 weeks probably is really not enough because you need some consolidation to happen. But probably some of or most of the effects might be there after 4 weeks, and the effects might be even larger after 8 or 12 weeks. But I just can say 6 weeks work because that's what we did.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. And I mean, I have, and Dr. Dan, who's here, has done a lot of coaching too. I've seen people see pretty significant improvement in 1 week if they just actually apply the technique and try it out over and over. So it doesn't take long to learn. It takes longer to master, but that's okay. You'll start to see improvement really, really quickly. Dr. Dan, since we have you here, did you have any questions to ask Dr. Konrad?
Yes, I actually do. So thanks.
Please do. I'd love to hear your question.
I love what you do. First of all, that you're actually on the front lines researching this. We're on the back end, applying and everything, but establishing that there is, real evidence for this is wonderful. I'm so glad that you're doing that. I did have a couple questions. With the increased connectivity that you found after trainings, after 6 weeks, like you said, was that just an overall increase in connectivity, or did you find any interesting specific areas that were more connected than before? Obviously, maybe some learning and memory pathways, but was there anything else that was interesting or surprising?
Mm-hmm. Probably not that surprising. So yes, we can cluster those hubs which have the highest changes in this network architecture. Then again, it's still a correlational analysis. So it might be that some small hubs were extremely meaningful, but because we didn't have too many nodes in there, we didn't see that pop up more. So what I'm saying now does not exclude that other regions are highly important, but this form of analyzing couldn't fully allow us to see it. But those hubs where we have many nodes and many nodes were highly involved in the changes we see were indeed prefrontal cortex, medial temporal lobe, and visual cortex. So not so surprising. But then again, it's also good to have confirmation so that it makes sense. If we had completely random hubs, it would also be, it doesn't make sense. So these clearly made sense. And the very strong role of visual cortex, of course, was also important because it strengthens the point of visualization in those techniques.
Okay, thank you. And one other question I had, one thing I'm really interested in is the difference between rewiring the brain for deficiencies or compensating for deficiencies, where you kind of just find, an alternate way to do things. So I'm curious, if someone feels like they have a poor memory, they're learning the memory techniques and their memory goes up. Does your research indicate that that is actually changing their natural learning and memory wiring, not just compensating for it?
Not really. I would rather say it's indicating more on compensating, because these pathways have been there before and those are strengthened. So you basically train your brain to use pathways that work well instead of using those that were less efficient. So I would, well, of course, yeah, you have methods like DTI, but these are really hard to see changes over this period of time with the specific form of training. So what we look in connectivity is really functional connectivity. It's basically, as I said, correlation analysis, how different brain regions tend to work together. So we don't really go down to really measuring white matter changes with this technology, as it's harder with MRI, and you would need more invasive methods, which we cannot justify using in healthy volunteers just for scientific purpose. But therefore, my interpretation, again, to word it a bit carefully, my interpretation is it's more compensating in a way that you train your brain in using more efficient pathways that are probably already there. And then even also when looking at older age, this training is usually called compensating training in the studies, as we assume you're teaching your brain to use to have more fallback options, and when things start to go wrong, you just have more options to go back to, and you are more trained in using your brain in different ways so that you're compensating for the loss that still might occur due to the pathology, to the disease itself.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay. So it seems like overall it's more just building up those reasonably strong pathways, using kind of building up their strengths, those, so to speak, more so than avoiding all the weaker areas.
Yeah, but how I try to see it, or if I have a public speech, but also actually when I talk to first-year students, I'll use similar examples. It's like what we know where these pathways are coming from, what's basically the evolution as far as we can understand it of memory systems over long periods of time. If you look at how it works in mammals, they all have a medial temporal lobe. Hippocampus seems to be relevant for all of them. And then even guess how this evolved, then it seems to be extremely important that memory evolved for us not to be able to chat at the fireplace about last week because it's nice to be social, but to be able to predict or plan actions in the future based on what happened before. And therefore, the memory systems that work really well are usually those related to our experience. Stuff that happened to us. It might involve emotion. They typically involve location. Just 2014, the Nobel Prize for Medicine Physiology was awarded for the neuroscientist who discovered place cells and grid cells. And these systems obviously play a big role when you think of a memory palace, because normally when someone tries to memorize, or let's say learn, you just don't want to memorize a book typically, but learn what's in the book. It's still, you're in the same place, at the same desk the whole time, looking at the same font of text. So all of these systems don't get engaged. If you know you use the memory palace, you engage them. So that's what I mean. You probably have all these systems that work well, but it's usually pretty hard to engage them in the things we encounter in our daily lives. But if you apply these techniques, if you train them a bit, you strengthen those pathways, you train using them, and you engage them in learning tasks where they're normally not involved. And therefore, you make good use of those memory systems that are just generally better and had an earlier relevance in the evolution of memory. And then the more verbal parts, understanding text, higher cognitive thinking, that's limited to parts of the brain that are most involved in humans, but are therefore also less central, basically. So the visual system, the medial temporal lobe, that's the center. And we added stuff on top as humans. But then if you stay only this limited parts that are amazing for the highest cognition you can perform, we leave out other systems that just work really well. So that's basically the idea behind it, that some memory systems work really well, and few people complain not being able to remember where they were on location last year. If that's an issue, you probably have issues. And for most people, that's not the thing they are concerned about, but it's tough time memorizing important information at work, remembering all the stuff in emails and project meetings that are popping up on any screen on my phone, on the screen, because it's for a brain, it's all one place, you're sitting in one place. So it cannot place it literally anywhere. And by engaging these systems for place, for image, for emotion, you just use the brain in a way it works best.
Oh, I love that. So if I were to put that in my own words, you're essentially saying, it's not compensating, like, because your normal memory pathways are weak, we're going to use something else. More, it's your normal strongest memory pathways are the things that are used by memory techniques.
Exactly.
That in our modern life, we don't usually use those enough, but yet they're just the inherently strongest, inherently best. So it's not compensating because you're weak. It's compensating in terms of you're just going back to using your strongest strengths that we all have and that we aren't taught to use.
Right.
Thank you.
So that leads me to a question. We got a question from one of our audience members, but I want to throw this one in before, just because we're on the topic. But so if I'm understanding what you and Daniel are both saying, it seems like we move into using weaker strategies over time rather than defaulting to the stronger strategies. So why do you think that happens? Because like the brain obviously wants to be super energy efficient. So why do we, well, at least most people that I interact with tend to default to pretty weak strategies? Why isn't it kind of instinctive, or is it instinctive and then we do something to deviate from our instincts? Like what's going on there? Why are we using the weaker pathways or weaker tools?
Again, mostly only speculate. I don't think it's really scientifically proven how it's one way or the other. But as I said, even something like language evolved in terms of evolutionary timescales rather recently. It sounds a bit weird, but those people investigating that, saying that the first humans appeared on Earth like 2.5 million years ago, but Homo sapiens, our kind, it's maybe 200,000 years, 300,000 years ago. But to all we know, humans can only speak for like 100,000 years, right? And that was still simple language. To how it's possible to investigate that, researchers say that probably humans, modern humans, can only speak language that is similar to what you use for like 35,000 years. So for the first 170,000 years, humans couldn't even speak like we speak today. And then writing, first writing systems, like not paintings, cave paintings, but actually writing systems to code language only came up like 5,000 years ago. So on an evolutionary time scale, your brain isn't even evolved for writing. So it's just so new that maybe therefore it's not this well linked in. Basically, it's a little oversimplified, I admit that, but basically a baby born today has more or less the same brain, the same hardware to start with as one human baby 40,000 years ago. But for the one 40,000 years ago, the highest cognitive ability in the whole life was to speak a simple language. And if you look around on Twitter, you can see that's true, but that's a different story. But it explains a little bit where this might come from, that this is just something so new in terms of how our brain evolved, that therefore it's so busy with itself that it's not tapping into these more evolved, more efficient systems. But if we involve them by just making up rooms in our heads, thinking of locations, using more images, we can engage those systems that work well.
So I know I understand this is speculation, but the speculation there would be, at least in our, modern cultures, we use language a lot for a lot of things. And so it's just socially programmed sort of to be defaulting to using language rather than using what our ancestors would have used more heavily or relied on more heavily, even though technically those systems are much more well established. Is that?
Yeah, I think I can agree on
that. That's the hypothesis. All right. So question from Quinn. I'll just read this here. Says, does Dr. Boris or other speakers or have you conducted any research or have any references to any research whether memory techniques such as mnemonics and memory palace are also effective to retain and recall information for people suffering from, say, mild dementia, depression that leads to memory loss, or sorry, a long sentence, or disruption in cognitive function, brain issues due to marijuana addiction, Alzheimer's, etc. So I think if I were to shorten that question, basically, I think the question is, are the memory techniques also effective for people with those issues listed?
Yeah, I think we briefly covered it at the beginning when I mentioned what we are working on. So in terms of mild cognitive impairment, very early Alzheimer's, mild dementia, there are good hints that it can help, basically in the sense that it doesn't cure or direct the disease itself, but it builds this compensatory mechanisms. It builds a cognitive reserve. So basically what we assume, there are some studies to back that up. In the US, there was a called active study where they compared kind of different forms of trainings in senior homes, but one of them was mnemonic training that had some promising results. That you typically expect you might delay the onset or the severeness of dementia diseases for a few years, but you might see at the end that it then goes rather quickly really wrong, because the brain could compensate, but when it then fails to compensate even that, so much already was gone that it's really a heartbreak. But but then it's not all not worth it. Well, I would say the opposite. You still gain years of good performance. So the onset might be similar to another person, and the end might be similar, but the curve in between, you had many years of self-functioning, of cognitive ability you're still at least satisfied with. So the answer would be, we don't think it cures the disease, but it's still very helpful in the prevention of those. You mentioned dementia. There is one guy, the lonely fighter, but it's amazing, and I hope more work will be done from Belgium, called Caspar Bormans, who has used memory palace training in treating patients with dementia, and the memory symptoms those often show, and it also was quite promising. Again, this is somewhat isolated study so far. Look for the work of Caspar with a K, K-A-S-P-E-R, Caspar Bormans from Leuven in Belgium. That are some nice studies. Again, oversimplifying it a lot, but basically the idea is that you teach someone a memory palace who might be depressed. I think I used the wrong word before. I'm talking about depression here. So someone who's depressed, and then if you ask them, tell me 10 happy memories of yours, they don't think I have any. Well, did you have a memory? Oh yeah, marriage actually. Yeah, that was nice. Did you ever have a good trip? Oh yeah, this one year we did the cruise. That was really fun. So I remember that. And with your kid, oh yeah, when my daughter married, that was amazing. And when my son finished school, and then asking about, so you have some good memories? No, I don't remember. And then you do the same thing and let them place it in the memory palace, and then ask them, go through the memory palace to find back good memories. And it does help their mood. It does help their memory for positive things and reduce the negativity bias. Again, not massive effect sizes, but clear effects. They need more work. There are a few studies so far, but it's pretty promising. I'm not sure of anyone using mnemonic techniques in Mariana addiction memory decline, because Mariana targets some things in the brain that are very relevant for the memory system. So an overuse of this can actually do harm to the brain. So that's why it's explainable, but I'm not sure if anyone has investigated if mnemonic techniques can be compensating for that. I think there has been limited work, again, very limited, but some work with memory-related complaints in terms of pregnancy in women, and that it might be helping here. My interpretation of that was it's more what we also covered before, actually showing them it's not that bad. So it's a little more, actually the issues here often come from sleep loss, and sleep is very important for memory performance. Of course, sleep is reduced already before and certainly after giving birth. And then these memory techniques just show them that they still can do amazing things. I mean, maybe even things they didn't believe were possible before, and just switches their mindset. Oh, it's not that bad. And then it works better.
I often use the analogy, because you mentioned with depression, like one thing that could potentially be helpful would be storing happy memory or references to happy memories in a memory palace. And I think the function of that is, like, memory palaces they help you to locate memories. I like to think of it that way. It's kind of like if you imagine you have like this, you're trying to start a library or something. So if you imagine your memory is a warehouse or something, and if you were to just walk in there and throw a book, right? Like that'd be throwing a memory in there, throwing it somewhere. You keep doing that over years and years, and you've just got piles of books all over the place, and you can't find anything. It's really difficult. And what a memory palace is, it's basically just an indexing tool. That's one way to think of it. It's like, okay, well now that book has a specific spot. So if I want to find that book, I know where that book is in my memory, and I can get back to it. And so, what you're talking about with depression, it's like they have these happy memories, but they're kind of thrown in there, and they're not easy to find. And because of some other aspects of depression, makes it even harder to remember that they're in that warehouse at all. But if they have that index, they have that spot, it's like, I know I can return to that spot in my memory warehouse, and that's where I can find those happy memories. It becomes a lot more accessible, even if there's a fog or something for other reasons. It just becomes a lot easier to recover them again.
Exactly. To add just a piece of science here again, there's some theoretical model actually behind that. A guy called Anders Ericsson, who in your community probably is also very famous for his research on expertise. He was often termed like the expert on expertise. He sadly passed away last year, or only 2 years
I didn't know that.
I got to meet him in Florida a few years back, and we worked a little bit together, which was amazing. And he already in the 80s and 90s did lots of amazing work with people who show superior memory in very different fields. So not just memory athletes. With all the memory researchers, he's really famous because he managed to convince some students already in the 80s to train their memory for digits to 80 and above, with actually not being using efficient memory techniques, kind of making up their own. But they could have done it way more efficient. But this work is really famous. But he didn't really care so much about memory athletes who weren't around back then, or these mnemonic techniques. But he showed that very similar things, what memory athletes do on purpose with their strategies, happen in chess players who are amazing in remembering chess matches. Just recently saw an interview with Magnus Carlsen, the chess world champion, and they just mentioned, and this match from the world championship match from 2004. Oh yeah, there was this position and this move, and he did this, and this was really weird, and this was wrong. And like, how does he remember all of that? And if you would ask him this, he probably couldn't even give you a convincing answer, or just remember. But Ericsson showed, together with another researcher called Chase, that by studying chess so much, they built what he termed a retrieval structure that they have this index. If you have someone like LeBron James, who's extremely famous for being able to do more or less the same thing with basketball matches, it's not just in there. You might even describe it like this, but if you then trace how he explains it, you can very clearly show he has this index system. It's not going from it's there, but it's stored with the retrieval structure. And then mnemonic techniques just basically let you build your retrieval structure. So retrieval structure, if you put it in Google Scholar, you'll find those works. It's a term used in the so-called skilled memory theory by Ericsson. And he was even more extreme than me. So he was not a memory athlete, he was still a researcher, but he would be more extreme than me in saying there is no talent for memory. It's all just making use of how it works best. And he says it's only 3 principles in a skilled memory theory, extremely simple theory. Therefore, it's meaningful encoding, which in terms of memory athletes, he would call that's a mnemonic technique. That's a major system. Turn digits into images because that's more meaningful. It's retrieval structures. That's a memory palace. And it's speed up. If you train this for a few weeks or longer, you just get very faster in doing that. So initially, it takes you time to make these links. It takes you time to make a memory palace and put an image in there. And if you just did it a few times, you train meaningful ways with the retrieval structure. So therefore, good ways. So if you train over and over to memorize cards just by telling them to you, you also get better, but you train something very inefficient. So if you first learn a specific method, of course, you still have a training effect. That's why memory athletes still get better over time. But he says, and he's more extreme than me in this, that there's no talent for memory and everyone could do exactly the world record level. I'm not fully convinced of this. I think there's still like mental speed, whatever factors.
Yeah, sure.
He was kind of extreme on that. But of course, the basic is right. Everyone who's healthy can learn to memorize a deck of cards and probably also a deck of cards fast. But still only one person in every moment of time has a world record.
Yeah, and I think if I remember the chess player stuff correctly, one of the interesting findings was that master chess players, they had a fantastic memory for positions of chess pieces, as long as those chess pieces were in positions they could actually be in a real, like they could actually end up there in a real chess match. If you put the pieces in random positions that they could never actually arrive at according to the rules of chess, then they were either no better than the average person or it wasn't significant. I don't remember exactly what.
Exactly. Yeah.
But yeah, essentially they had an existing structure for here's all the positions that chess pieces can take in the course of a game. They train that over playing thousands and thousands and thousands of matches. And so they'd seen those configurations. And so there was already basically like a placeholder in their brain for that. But if they didn't have a placeholder in their brain already set up for that and trained, they couldn't store it any better than the average person. So I think, yeah, that's one of the big insights with with, I think, the memory palace, basically all you're doing is you're saying, okay, well, now I've set up a space for things. And if you don't have that, you're just kind of throwing it in there, hoping you can pull it back out. But now it's like, okay, I've got a spot to put this. And that makes it a lot easier to retrieve. You mentioned early in the call, you threw out the term boundaries. And I wanted to ask about that. Like, what were you talking about with boundaries? I have a feeling has to do with like actual, like the boundaries of a memory palace and segmenting things and giving them spaces, like I was just talking about. Is that what you were referring to when you said boundaries earlier?
That's my interpretation. That's my interest in something to investigate further, because I think it's relevant and has been overlooked so far and not studied at all in another benefit of mnemonic techniques. There are many studies that have been done also in recent years. Some have been old, but in neuroscience, it came back in recent years also, that show if you just have someone watch a video and then different things happen. Also, where is brain activation, just really like even ERP signals going up, but also then in terms of memory for what happens whenever they change a room or another person enters or a piece of furniture folds over. That's a boundary moment. They can be tiny, they can be bigger, like a room change. And this sets also the boundaries for your memory process. So if you have a somewhat static scene where people are talking and not much is happening, your memory for that will get worse rather quickly. But if then the door opens, the next thing again, you remember better. These single things, and extremely famous and a little oversighted study, like if you have people who are skilled in diving, and you let them memorize something above water and underwater, and later retrieve it above water and underwater, they will know the above water stuff better above water and the underwater stuff better underwater. If you have a student or just a volunteer, if you have a volunteer in your study and let them memorize something in one room and then have a 20-minute break and then they record it there, the performance will be better than if you do exactly the same thing, the same material, let them memorize it, then tell them, come with me, and let them write it down in a different room. Exactly the time, same time frame. And it's not like that they walk for 20 minutes, they're exhausted. It's just like they walk 20 meters. But now they sit in a lobby instead of the closed office where they memorized it, or vice versa, just changing the location, being in a different place, your memory gets worse. So context is important for our brain. And even these tiny moments of boundaries are relevant. So when you're reading a book, which might be in particular a nonfiction book, that's also not written by someone skilled in writing in an entertaining way, it might have some main chapters. The most terrible books, but still we hand them out to students all the time. They have 6 main chapters with 3 sub-chapters each, and then just a wall of text. And it also doesn't have much boundaries. Just if you then add a picture, even if it's a random picture, it's a boundary, and the next thing you remember better. If you add the quote, it looks different. Suddenly it's a boundary, and for your brain, it gets more relevant again. And then, of course, if you apply mnemonic techniques, like basically each loci gives a new boundary, and certainly each room. We talked about memory palaces earlier. For those who might know this and really want to do it now, I recommend always having 10 loci in a room. That's my way of doing it. Some people, if a whole room is one location, I'm more specific in this virtual background here of mine. It might be the sofa, it might be the bookshelf, it might be the brain tree on the wall, and the plant and the window, like really specific objects. And I usually choose 10 in a room. And then the next room is a new set. So I can go room by room or loci by loci. Then, of course, a new room is a huge boundary, but each loci already is a tiny boundary. And if I use this just to come up with some brief images, not even linking them too strongly while reading a difficult text, I just add so many more boundaries that this might also help the memory process by itself. Yeah. But again, there's no research to back up that mnemonic techniques do this, but it sounds very reasonable to me. And I find it fascinating that they've done, really like even on the cell level by now with patients where you have single cell recordings. Interesting work, how relevant it is that it really can be measured on the tiniest level in the brain, how boundary affects what's happening there.
Yeah, so I think there are, that brings to mind for me 2 things, which might be the same thing, but one of them would be kind of just intuitive from experience of like, if anyone's ever, I'm sure most people have had this, where you have a really consistent schedule for a while. Maybe it's because you're in school classes, you have kind of a rhythm to your job, whatever. It's a lot easier to remember what day it is, right? Then if you don't have a consistent schedule, because there's milestones, right, in terms of your time. It's like, okay, well, maybe you always have lunch with a certain coworker on Wednesdays. And so you remember things in terms of, well, was it after that lunch with my coworker, in which case it would have been later Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, or if it was before that lunch with my coworker, then I know it was on Monday, Tuesday. And you have these milestones that exist chronologically in time, but also physically in space. Like if you're going to give someone instructions to go somewhere, you could say like turn right at the Wendy's on that corner. But if there's no landmarks whatsoever, you'd say, well, just turn right. Well, where? At some point, turn right, right? But the milestones actually allow you to differentiate places. And if you don't have that, then there's nothing to hold on to, so to speak, for your memory. So I think that makes a lot of sense intuitively. But I wanted to pull in Dr. Dan because I think he knows a lot more than I do about like state dependence, which seems to be something that might be connected to this. Sorry if I'm pulling you in the wrong point, but I saw you nodding. I thought that might be what you were thinking of.
Yeah, I mean, I think you guys already said this, but it kind of just clicks better in my head that with the memory palace, you're essentially putting yourself in the same place to learn and to recall the material, which is what state-dependent learning is all about, just being in the same context when you learn it and when you retrieve it later. And that fires up the same connections in your brain so you can retrieve it easier. And with the memory palace, you're just doing the same thing. You're learning it in your locus, and then you retrieve it later by going back to the same locus. So it's kind of just creating tons of little opportunities to be in unique contexts.
Yeah, and this is where, my neuroscience is not very strong, but my understanding is that, so when a memory is created, and I'd like to hear from either or both of you on this, but like about the process of how a memory is created. But my understanding is that basically you have an action potential that fires through some sort of pathway. And when that happens, it strengthens the connections along that pathway. Whenever a certain path is followed, so to speak, it gets the connections along that pathway get a little bit stronger. And when a memory is formed, a certain pathway is fired. And then when the memory is recalled, it's the same or very similar pathway is fired again. Is that a accurate way to say that? Could you sharpen it up for me?
Yeah, that sounds good to me. I don't know what your thoughts, Boris.
Yeah, it sounds good to me, with one addition, which is that a memory consolidation is a process that's relevant, and where these pathways are addressed from, this does change quite a bit. So initially, we assume that for most memories, not for all memory system, but for most, the hippocampus seems to be the site with kind of the most recent index of new connections that have been formed. So the new connections probably already have been formed in neocortex in places where they are supposed to be, but the hippocampus knows where they are. And then a couple of days later, it's not the hippocampus anymore. There are some very obvious studies that showed that, which also means, for example, if people who have, which is often the case, diseases with atrophy in the brain, plasticity is really high in the hippocampus. If these things get worse, memory diseases might happen, dementia. That's why you often see that the most recent memories gets worse. The ability to form new memories gets worse, but you still remember what you did as a child. So there's Alzheimer patients with a huge progress, might have trouble recognizing their kids, but can you tell you exactly where they went to elementary school? Because the most oldest thing are the most robust in there. So there are things that change a little bit, but what you said is still true, and that's important because even students sometimes miss this. We don't think this information itself is transferred completely different places, but where you address it from. The system, again, who wants to look up a little more on that, is called, it's again still a theory. It has quite good evidence, but it's active systems consolidation theory. You can then talk about what's all happening in the brain. It's also a field where a lot of research is happening at the moment. What's really clear is that sleep is important for that. Completely different topic we could talk about a lot, or not do that today. But I think 20 years back when I was a student, I don't think something like SuperHuman community existed yet. But then when I met with people who wanted to improve in different fields, it seemed attractive to many to sleep as little as possible. So you have as more time awake as possible. And we know this is completely stupid. Don't ever do this. We've done one little study ourselves when I was still back in Munich together with the sleep lab, and we show that it's surprising that you can find some compensating mechanisms again, that your cognitive level isn't as worse as it should be for the sleep loss you have, or the lack of sleep you have. But for the hormonal regulation, for memory consolidation, for these things, it's terrible. So please don't try to cut on sleep to have more productive time. Instead, rather try to sleep well, because it's extremely important for your cognitive abilities and for your memory consolidation.
Yeah. Okay. So with the memory formation, so to me, this makes sense in terms of like the state dependence and everything. It's like if you want to fire the same pathway again to recall the memory that was formed, you want to fire that same pathway where it was formed, you'd want to have as many of the same cues as possible, or you want to have as many similar environmental / internal factors. You want to create the exact same scenario you were in when the memory was formed, because then the same pathway will fire hypothetically. I mean, that's my way to phrase it. But then when you said about memory consolidation, my question with that is, when memory is consolidated, I know that primarily happens during sleep, or at least sleep's important for that. Is the brain changing the pathway that's used to, I don't know, encode or recall a memory? I kind of think of it like, and maybe this is a terrible analogy, but that's why I'm going to say it. I kind of think of it like, I think it's called defragging on a computer, where it's the information wasn't stored in the most efficient way. We're taking out a lot of the spaces and compressing it, so it's a more efficient storage. Is that analogy good at all? Is that a terrible analogy? How would you explain what's actually happening in here when consolidation occurs?
Looking forward to hear what Dan thinks about it, but in this case, I would say it's a terrible analogy.
Great, thank you.
Because what we assume is happening is that the brain's actually replaying memories you had, and therefore it's active again. So you rather strengthen those. But then there might also be something called synaptic downscaling, that in general connections are weakened, but the more recent memories or relevant memories are replayed and therefore strengthened again, so that in comparison they're even stronger. And then what you maybe use your warehouse analogy before, it's like you get a lot of new stuff in your warehouse. So you have a list with the packages of the new stuff, which at the beginning is just at the reception desk. And then overnight, all the busy workers put it into correct shelves and then add it to the correct registers. In this case, in the brain, it's not put to different places, but the register is updated. So you don't have this temporary short-term lists, but you integrate it into long-term lists, but it's still resting in the same shelf.
Okay, so if I'm trying to understand what's actually happening in the brain. So, one way I've heard it described is the consolidation process that happens. Basically, your brain is extracting the gist from the experience, the memory. And so what that might be is that it's, like you said, some of the connections that were originally made maybe aren't actually as important according to some criteria in your brain. There's probably lots of them that we have no idea about, but and so it kind of lets those connections weaken, but the ones that seem most important to you for whatever reason, survival or your personal experience or whatever, those ones get strengthened. So it's not that it's how would I describe it? It's not like moving the pathway, but it might be trimming it. Could that be a way to say it?
Yeah, I'm more involved with this. Trimming it and building different entry places, different access points to those pathways. Okay. So building different access points. So yeah, you mentioned like how the hippocampus is involved, especially early on, but then later it's not so much involved. So is it how does that handoff occur? I guess that's, how does the brain build new access points? What does that look like? Yeah, that's what we have, a theory of active systems consolidation, which basically says that while we sleep or have so-called non-sleep deep rest, it also seems to happen if we rest without thinking about anything, which most people don't do that often, that specific signals occur in the hippocampus called ripples. They're not really possible to measure in non-invasive ways in humans, but have been shown with patients where we have single neuron recording. These ripples kind of indicate, hey, I have this recent memory. It's stored in the cortex. Have a look at that. very simple terms, right? And then we see so-called spindle signals in the EEG signal in the cortex, and then they lead to more spread out signaling. So basically, the temporary list says, here's something on the temporary list, let's reactivate that, and then link it to more long-term systems so it can be more integrated in those pathways that find back long-term relevant information. And then if it's new and it's not replayed, and you mentioned criteria. One criteria certainly is randomness. It just also happens randomly. It might be so decreased or not further integrated that you don't find it back or even lose it.
Got it. We did have one other question from Quinn, so I'll ask that one, and then I've got my final question. I think that'll probably round out our time today. So from Quinn here, is it possible to reuse memory palaces? It's a really common question for different subjects, ideas, etc. Yeah,
absolutely. So most important thing is time. So if it's something you want to remember for long term, we speak about learning, about studying, things you really want to remember long term, you will have to have some retrieval, ideally retrieval practice, to make it really long-term memories. So long-term in the sense, it's a long-term memory system and also working memory system that happens directly due to its nature of memory palace, but it still doesn't mean it's automatically there forever. But if you retrieve it ideally, maybe the same day, the next day, within a week, it gets really strengthened and you can keep it in there forever. But it means that therefore it's maybe already getting hippocampal independent, to go back to this point we just had, that after a week, maybe two, you can reuse the same loci for new information. And then indeed, I think Quinn also asked about same topic or different topic. I think it's easier early on to use it for a different topic. So if I think back of my time really being a student, when I had courses, even through a whole term, half a year at the university, I would try not to use the same loci within the same course or the same topic, but rather make up some more memory palaces, because once you get hang to that, it's really easy. If I tell people I have 100 memory palaces with 50 loci each, they go, but that's amazing. Not ever remembers that. It's already in your brain. You just never labeled that. It's absolutely not difficult. So if it's the same topic, I would rather add some loci. But I might have used exactly the same locations 2 weeks later for, when I was a year, for example, I remember I was a year in England as a student, at a year abroad. In Europe, there's this Erasmus program where you get some funding to go to a different country. I was in Europe for a year. And then we, as foreign students, had to memorize the British history and all these kings and wives of kings and who murdered who. Many people murdered many people. So I could use exactly the same loci for my physics courses and my computer science courses, where I also memorized these kings' names so they wouldn't disturb each other like at all. But in the same physics course, I might rather add more loci. Then again, you use maybe a memory palace for something temporary. You're invited to give a speech, you're leading a presentation, a workshop, a meeting. You memorize the agenda to do it without notes because it looks more proficient, it looks more skilled. It's more the awareness of others than really helpful, to be honest. But also in your head, it's nice that you really know the structure of the meeting. The meeting is done, you're not going to repeat that. And then a week or two later, you can use the same memory palace. Most extreme form memory sports, I memorized a deck of playing cards. I cannot use the same memory palace for another deck of cards the same day. I could, but that would be worse. I would confuse something. I would be way slower. Typically, when I do my online matches, if I use it once a week, that's fine for me. When I really plan for big live competitions, a World Memory Championship, a 3-day event, I would usually let those memory palaces rest 2 to 4 weeks to really don't have any intrusions of earlier images. And these materials, obviously, I don't do retrieval practice on because the order is not useful at all. I want to forget it. So I will not retrieve it. But if I had any reason to remember this specific order of playing cards forever, I could do that just by retrieving it occasionally. And then also still reuse the loci.
Yeah, whenever I get this question a lot, it's my answer is always try it out and see what happens. Like, look, you can make a memory palace really easy. That you've got many of them already. You just haven't thought of them, like you said. You just haven't labeled them. Try it out. If you see that it's causing issues for you, play around with it a little bit. And personal experimentation is always a great way to go. So give it a shot, see what happens. It probably won't be as complicated as you think. All right, so one last question. I ask this to everyone who joins us is, what does it mean to be superhuman, and then what does it mean to be human if you see a difference between those questions?
Well, how I would interpret superhuman in this context would be to do something that's clearly beyond the average performance of humans. In anything I do with memory, obviously I claim it's not superhuman at all, because everyone can do that. It's not an ability that differentiates me from other people, just a skill that I learned. Still, what I can show and what memory athletes do is so far beyond the average performance of people who never trained this, that it feels or is described as superhuman. And therefore, in my field, it would be the distinction. Now, I think, again, it's true for kind of a lot of fields, right? You might call the world chess champion on a superhuman level, but just because he's so much better than the average, it still doesn't mean he has a different brain, or his brain is wired differently, or he's a chess robot. Hopefully not. This would be my quick answer. And then being human, for me, compared, I have this topic, we didn't cover that today a lot. At the moment, I'm quite a lot booked to give keynotes for companies and associations to speak about artificial intelligence from the perspective of a memory researcher and neuroscientist. My key point always there is that even though an AI has now a mathematical neural network, that's not a brain. And even if we get there that we can build a neural network in a computer with 100 billion neurons, the number we have in our brain, which is realistic in a don't know how many years, it's still not a brain. So that's what differentiates us, our brain network. And many things you could talk about that. Of course, it's linked to all the neurons in our body as well. I think the belly brain has been a little over interpreted, but of course, it's relevant that we have millions of neurons down there. Of course, it's important that we have also sensory input. Of course, it's important that our brain stimulates itself. So these are all things where we are more than just a neural network. And that would be something where I would rather differentiate an artificial intelligence from a biological one, in particular the human one. And then, of course, it's not that we completely understood our intelligence or our ability or why we got conscious and developed speech to a level other animals have not. But still, these are fundamental differences to a way even a highly advanced neural network and whatever computer system out there we might not even be aware of nowadays is quite different to human. And then for me, this is where human, superhuman belong together. And then superhuman to me is just deviating from the average to the top, to the better performance by a lot, but not that you have any inherited advantage there.
Spoken like a scientist. All right, well, Dr. Konrad, it's been a pleasure. I would, love to give you a minute here, just if there's any place where people can find you, to find your books, anything that you're currently working on, where should they go? Thanks a lot.
If anyone wants to hear me speak, I have 2 TEDx talks, which accumulate a lot of views that are easily to be found on YouTube. My name is Boris Konrad, Boris like in Johnson. Not favorable for me, but I can't change that, but people remember. And Konrad with a K, like in Germany, Konrad Adenauer was the first chancellor, and it's a common name. It sounds a bit like concert. So to give some images, boriskonrad.com is my webpage. I think I'll pop up on LinkedIn as a first person, or Instagram. These are the 2 platforms I really use. I have accounts on Facebook and Twitter or X, but you won't read a lot from me there. If you actually want to read from me, follow me on Instagram for the more private stuff and where I'm appearing, and LinkedIn for a little more intelligent posts. As I said, I work internationally and virtually and on stages. So if that's relevant for anyone, feel free to reach out anytime. And for my books, I really have to nudge my publishers more to also get it into English, because so far that's not the case. I've published 4 books. They have been translated to Chinese, to Russian, to Italian, Dutch, Czech, but they so far didn't sell it to English because English and American publishers seem to believe they have sufficient good input from their native speakers. So they don't buy many translations. So I've sold by now tens of thousands of copies in a number of countries. And if any of those languages I mentioned helps, that's awesome. You'll find all the links on my webpage, boriskonrad.com, or your preferred online book store if you put my name in there.
Awesome. Well, hey, it's been a pleasure. It's been an honor. I'd love to speak again sometime. It sounds like we have a lot more ground we could cover on sleep and AI and all sorts of different things. So thank you for being here. Thank you, everybody in the Super Learner community, for tuning in, watching the replay, watching the live stream, or being here with us on the call. And we'll keep doing this because this is fun and I'm learning a lot. So as long as I'm learning, I'm going to keep doing it. I'll keep showing up.
Awesome.
And I think that'll be a long time. So thanks again, and stay in touch.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
The SuperHuman Academy Podcast is hosted by Collin Jewett and designed and edited by Army Cinco, with original music by Joshua Schunig and voiceovers by Corey Page Schunig. That's me. You can find past episodes and resources, as well as access to the ever-growing SuperHuman Academy community at superhumanacademy.com. If you like the show, don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review on your podcast platform of choice.